Wonderful to have you all here, and even more wonderful that we've got Terry McDonnell from University of Notre Dame here to give a talk and entertain a conversation over our lunch hour. The talk here is on creativity at social scale. Terry is the Henkel's Family College professor and department chair in sociology at Notre Dame, and he's going to provide us with this really interesting talk. So I'll let you Google more about him if you want to know any more background. I'm just going to turn the microphone over to our guest. Take it away, please.
Thanks, Doug. Excited to have this conversation and to be in this virtual room with you all. This is a project that I'm doing with Stephen Tepper. So many of you might know Stephen and his work. He's currently the president of Hamilton College, but he and I got our paths aligned when we were at Vanderbilt together at the Curb Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy back in the day. And we've been longtime collaborators and conversation partners and really committed to this idea of creativity and how it can be serve the public good. That's kind of something we both have a deep commitment to. And so this is a series of projects, really. Why am I not clicking? There we go. So this is a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years. We wrote a 3-part essay that was in Grantmakers in the Arts reader. You can use that QR code in the corner if you want to get quick access to that series of essays that we wrote. And it's been an ongoing book project. And so we've also brought on John Baer into the process. Some of you might know John. And so we're drafting a manuscript right now. So it's a great time for us to be getting some feedback on the big ideas of the book. Curious to see what you all think of the project and look forward to kind of thinking with you today about creativity at social scale. Okay. So I want to start with some paradoxes, right? The kind of the paradoxes that we've been thinking with in this project. So first, people say we want more creativity, right? We want more creativity in the world. We think of that as a good. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies say that creativity is the #1 skill that they look for in recent graduates. Students say they want careers that allow them to be more creative. And mayors across the United States want to develop creative cities that attract picky creative class workers. But in experience, creativity is pretty siloed in our culture. We celebrate it, yet it's constrained. Creativity tends to be in elite spaces, right? Or at least valued or trained for elite spaces. Creatives and organizations tend to be segregated, right? They're not well integrated within the broader institutional organization. They tend to be siloed in their own kind of parts of the building, right? And we have the kind of training and arts model that we have is hierarchical, it's elite, it's looking for talent and trying to find the best of the best, the cream of the crop, and then do the work of training those people up into excellence, which ignores a large amount of creativity that's happening for all those other people who are not going through elite arts programs. Okay, so there's a tension here between this kind of desire for more creativity, but creativity is actually pretty well separated from social life. Yes, also I should note too that social support for creativity drops away in adulthood, right? So a lot of young people are in school orchestras or taking art classes, but then after that, the infrastructure for creativity drops away. Another tension here is this kind of idea of creativity at social scale being oxymoronic, right? We have notions of scale that suggest robust, muscular, enduring, and impactful kind of outcomes of scale. Scale emphasizes replication, doing the same thing again and again, expansion into new domains, standardization, so it's easy to implement. Also, this idea of turning something singular into something repeatable and reproducible across contexts, right? So you kind of you make the widget and then you find ways of making that widget faster and bigger and bringing it to new markets. If you think about that in contrast to creativity, these feel like very different ideas, right? So if creativity is fragile, special, unpredictable, temporary, tied to charismatic artists, inventors, or entrepreneurs, rooted in historical notions of individual genius, right? So something hard to replicate. And it also feels rare and exclusive, something that happens in special places or by special people, right? So it's hard to spread that beyond the kind of the uniqueness of those special places or people. So if scale is every day, creativity is sacred. If scale is homogeneous, creativity is heterogeneous. If scale is mass, creativity is individual. So it's hard to think about these things in collaboration. But for us, we think this is a really important moment to be considering how creativity and social scale actually might work very well together. Um, we have a deep commitment to this idea that creativity is a power for the social good. So how do we scale that up so that more and more people are involved in creative activity? They place creativity at the center of their life, and that we place creativity at the center of our social processes, our education, our democracy, right? How do we make creativity kind of what we call the operating system of our world? So we think of creativity as this public good, and we think if creativity becomes more suffused in social life, it's going to have dramatic and positive outcomes, right? So we ask, what if it were the social operating system at the core of that? What if creativity was at the center of our civic and professional lives? What if those who see creativity as fuel for human thriving and social change begin to take scale seriously, right? As opposed to resisting scale. And borrowing here from Maria Rosario Jackson, why have we not thought of arts and culture as core to our resilience, sustainability, and advancement, to our health and well-being, right? Creativity for us is something that is a public good, that is serving the social good. And so how do we maximize its impact is the kind of the puzzle that we're working through in this project. Okay. So how do we scale up creativity for education, democracy, innovation, and other positive outcomes that we care about? Let me start first, though, by talking about creativity as an idea, right? And how we're thinking about it. We're defining it as the act of generating ideas, making unexpected connections, openness and novelty and difference, taking risks, and generating social meaning through shared stories and expression. Stephen and I come from an arts background, and so we're thinking about arts as the kind of modal case for us, but we want an expansive idea of creativity, one that captures a lot of different kinds of domains of action, not just the arts, though many of the examples that we think through are thinking through the worldly arts. In addition, we think of creativity as a skill, right, rather than an innate trait, something that can be honed and improved over time with practice, right? And that creativity is something that everyone's constantly creative, right? I mean, in everyday life, but that there are ways that we could be investing in our society to improve that skill of creativity for more and more people. So this raises this question of like, how would we organize creativity differently given these commitments, right? How is creativity, what model might we adopt that looks different than the model we currently have? And the way we're trying to theorize this and think about this is by looking at cases where creativity has scaled and spilled over in this very kind of inclusive, a pro-social kind of way. So what are those cases that are prototypical for what we're trying to get at, and how can we learn from those cases to kind of develop some kind of common patterns? Okay. So today's argument, I'm going to talk about three different kinds of cases that we've brought together. What we call creativity for everyone, creative crowds, and creativity everywhere. And through this, we'll talk about some mechanisms for kind of the scaling of creativity that we talk about as harnessing and honing for the public good. Okay. I'm going to start by talking about the maker movement, maker culture, maker spaces, maker fairs, Make Magazine, right? There's a whole culture out there of garage tinkerers who would be by themselves in their garage, inventing little household things and making little gadgets and inventions, doing work by themselves, disconnected, just because they love tinkering, right? But what's incredible about the maker movement is that it's brought these people together into a social network, right? It's created a platform, a series of platforms for people to engage with each other, to share their designs, to talk about new techniques, to learn from each other in ways that radically changes the quality of that experience for those people who are committed. Rather than atomized individuals, these people are engaged in dialogue, in connection, and communities of feedback, right? That really have changed the work that they can do. And so we interviewed Dale Dougherty, who's the founder of Make Magazine, one of these kind of places that pulled these folks together. And he was drawn to kind of making a magazine because he was seeing how people were experimenting, playing and trying to create culture, not just receive it. And I knew there were others like me who wanted to learn from each other. So we interviewed Dale and got a lot of really interesting insight from him about how important it was to kind of find these people, this kind of latent energy out there in the public, people who are creative, but could be made more creative and do more together than they could by themselves. So when we think about this kind of maker culture, we think about this as creativity for everyone, right? Here are people who are oftentimes not professional tinkerers, right? These are folks who are doing this as a hobby, and they're doing it in their garage, right? And what these platforms have done is harness that latent creative energy. It's created these platforms for exchange and networking, right? So Make Magazine people shared articles about new technologies that they could be picking up. Maker fairs allowed people to show off what they were doing to other people like them, get inspiration from other people within the community, learn new tips and techniques. Maker spaces are places where people share workspace and tools, right? And can train each other face to face, right? You also have other kinds of platforms where folks are exchanging designs, so that people the kind of open source kind of model that they have, right? So this kind of open, inclusive culture and commitment to sharing tools and designs really help bring these people together and learn from each other. And so that gets us this kind of honing of skills, right? This kind of the overall creative capacity of people who are involved in this community is increased, right? But through their participation. Whereas if they were just by themselves, it would be a lot harder to develop those skills because they're not getting that useful feedback in how to improve or to think differently. Okay. So Dale told us this incredible story around the COVID crisis and the ways in which makers were enrolled in helping manage the COVID crisis, especially in those early days. He says, Plan A was the government's going to help us, and they weren't doing their job. Plan B was, oh, we'll turn to the corporations. General Motors will make ventilators, right? That didn't work. Plan C was citizens. Just how do we organize ourselves to be able to solve this? That's where I like to find creativity. We need to figure out how to do things that haven't been done locally. That's a creative process. It's a problem-solving process. And what Dale observes is that makers stepped up in the void, right? When there weren't enough masks, makers found ways of making them, right? They did this incredible work of designing 3D printable mask plans, right? And he tells a story about how a professor at DePaul University, right when everything shut down, took all the 3D printers at the lab out of their lab at the university and distributed them to people with connection to the lab in the maker community. And then they shared plans and made personal protective equipment for hospitals and masks for people, and then circulated them through the city when there was a lack in that moment of crisis, right? And he observes, quote, when designs become digital, they could go anywhere. If you have the equipment locally, you can make something. You can modify it there to local needs, right? And so this idea that the interconnectedness, right, and the skill and the knowledge that these communities have built has allowed them to kind of fill this void. Whereas if they were all isolated atomistic tinkerers, it would be very difficult to scale up the impact that they were able to do given this infrastructure that they had built. Okay. So this capacity was built over time through people's curiosity, fun, play, and creativity. None of these folks thought we're going to be here for when the crisis hits, right? They were there because they were enjoying it as a hobby, right? But they were able to meet the public needs of the moment because they had engaged in that creative activity over many, many years. So creativity for everyone is about making art and creativity more accessible, but also in the service of building up that creative capacity, right? Of honing those skills, creating communities where they could be called into service, into civic life, into moments of crisis, into community building efforts that would have long-term and more powerful effects just beyond just the art making itself. So just a few examples of other cases we're thinking with here. Sarah Uris Green has had a great YouTube series called The Art Assignment, where she would interview professional artists, and they would then give an assignment to the public, asking them to make their own art in line with the kind of assignment. And then there was a great deal of sharing and community building and conversation around those products. Kind of building a real community of folks who might otherwise not think of themselves as an artist. Minecraft, has exploded. My kids are certainly obsessed with Minecraft. And what Minecraft users realize is that you could move from a kind of a consumption model of video game engagement to a production model where users can mod culture in the service of changing the game and sharing those ideas with other people and being creative. And folks realized you could use this for education. And so Minecraft.edu was created and enrolled 7,000 classrooms across more than 40 different countries into different kinds of Minecraft engagement opportunities, such as like acting out the Shakespeare in the global theater in miniature in Minecraft, or testing theories of gravity. It goes on and on and on, all the different creative uses they've used for Minecraft. And another great example here is my collaborator Stephen Tepper's work when he was at Arizona State University as Dean of the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. There was a real commitment at getting more people into arts education, right? And they had to think very differently about how to scale up in order to kind of meet that goal. And so they have 8,000 students at Herberger. And they did some really creative things. They're taking their first year architecture class, and instead of doing everything inside the architecture space, classroom space, they blew out the classroom, taking over 3 different athletic fields and using that as a place to build that capacity so people could build out their projects. Okay. Okay, another case that we think through a lot, which brings us to the kind of creative crowds idea, is the AIDS quilt, right? Cleve Jones had the idea that it was important to memorialize folks who had died from HIV, and saw a political opportunity in making the kind of the devastation of the AIDS crisis visible by taking quilt panels, memorializing individuals, and then putting them onto the National Mall. So this creative crowds idea is about harnessing people who may not be actively involved in art, but who want to engage creatively because they're inspired by an idea, right? So a simple, powerful idea. If you've lost a loved one due to AIDS, having the ability to express and just express yourself and your love for that person, right? And so it harnesses that creativity in the service of memorialization, but also you can see by the scale here just how the impact of the AIDS crisis on the United States, right? And it makes clear the political stakes of not doing something around the AIDS crisis. So creative crowds are cases where people get lots of folks involved and engaged in creative acts with purpose, right? And these are pretty low barrier to entry kinds of projects. It's not like you have to have a lot of skill or training to do this work. Um, uh, uh, it's oftentimes cheap, right? To kind of make a quilt panel. But it allows people to see themselves as being part of something bigger than themselves, right? And doing that through the production of art and in ways that then have real impact on civic life. So you can think of other kinds of cases, like Mel Chin's $100 bill project, where he had school students, he kind of went to different schools and had students represent a world without lead, right? So this is in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and lead poisoning was on the rise. And then he would come around with armored trucks and take all of those bills that the students had produced, right? And then move them from school to school, from community to community to raise awareness around lead poisoning. You also have the Great Wall of LA from Judy Baca, kind of taking a space in LA, making a giant mural, right, that tells the history of California through the eyes of people of color, kind of celebrating identity, but also activating political imagination. And the way she did this work is by recruiting people from a juvenile justice program in order to kind of help them understand the power of art, learn skills of mural making, and also kind of express their identity and their commitments to their communities. You also have other examples like Post Secret, where from Frank Warren, where people would write a secret on a postcard and make art around it. And send that in. And then he realized as that was going on that there were a lot of people struggling with depression and ideational thoughts. So he turned that into a project committed to making people aware of suicide and working to prevent suicide. In addition, Survivor Love Letter from Tani Ikeda encouraged survivors of sexual assault and others to write love letters to survivors as a way to kind of raise awareness, but also as a form of care. The third kind of case that we're interested in talking about is what we call creativity everywhere. This is where creativity suffuses institutions. It becomes forms that kind of spread like wildfire. One case that we use to think through this is the vagina monologues. V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, made this powerful work, the vagina monologues. But then that work has been performed within different communities all around the world. But they also organized what's called V-Day, where people produce performances of the play, and that's also inspired a lot of other folks to kind of take this form and make their own art, kind of using the monologue form, using the kind of the political project that V has put together. So she says, from all over America and the world, everybody has kind of joined these forces together of dance and poetry and song and art installations to break through this kind of denial and patriarchal wall and prison that we all live in all the time. And it's so beautiful to see everybody doing it in their own way, in their own community, adapting it to their own culture, right? So kind of adapting to the local form, right? To local community, adapting the form to the local community is this kind of powerful move. And just in South Bend, where I live, there's Noelle Elliott who created the monologue. So every year, local mothers write monologues and submit them for performance there. There's also Show Some Skin at Notre Dame, which is a monologue show that takes stories written by Notre Dame students about their experiences about race on campus and then represent those for an audience. So this has become a really powerful form to engage in important questions of power and identity. So we can think about how creativity everywhere, the kind of the spreading of this model, right, into existing social systems has real potential, right? So Art Place America, creative placemaking is a great example where folks are embedding artists into communities, government agencies, and institutions as a way to kind of show the value of creativity by embedding those folks into those not always creative settings. You can think about the rise of citizen science, looking at kind of the protein folding puzzles that have come around where people are tasked with figuring out ways to fold proteins and kind of crowdsourcing this as a way to quickly figure out what possible patterns of folding of protein folds are possible, advancing science in pretty powerful ways. And you can think of ways in which theater has been enrolled to kind of promote more democratic processes, right? So, kind of thinking about legislative theater or Michael Rhodes' a show, How to End Poverty in 90 Minutes, which are really drawing people into the democratic process in powerful ways and getting them to think about democracy and how it works in the service of trying to advance pro-democratic goals. So, to conclude, I've talked about three different kinds of cases today. Every creativity for everyone, which is kind of emphasizing, how we might open up pathways for creativity, lowering barriers, building creative capacity at a societal level, right? So that could be harnessed when needed. Creative crowds, so kind of collecting the creative power in individuals as a mass, kind of seeing that the scale of issues is powerful. These small acts of art making add up to something bigger and hopefully some democratic renewal. We think of this as petitions as an alternative, right? When you are walking down the street and someone comes up to you and asks to sign a petition, your signature, you might care about that issue, but it doesn't drive you to be committed in the ways that making art and sharing that art and engaging other people, right, might actually encourage more social commitment and civic participation. And then finally, thinking about creativity everywhere, embedding creativity within social systems and institutions, centering creativity in creative forms, and thinking about how those can spread to suffuse creativity through social life in more powerful ways. So, how do we scale creativity? I think Stephen and John and I have talked a lot about this idea of scaling for quality, right? That scaling isn't just for the service of getting more numbers, more widgets sold. The idea is how do we scale creativity without making it homogenous, right? How do we scale creativity where it doesn't where you have that local context, that local uniqueness, right? But it's not a boilerplate recipe that everyone follows to reach the same end, right? I've done work on kind of the insidiousness of best practices within health institutions, right? So designing AIDS campaigns and following the same system of design and practice, producing really mediocre campaigns that don't really have much effect. That's not the kind of thing we're looking for. We're looking for a real quality creative engagement that embraces creativity and all its complexity rather than just kind of having people do the same thing over and over again. We also focus on connection and inclusion. We think of this as social scaling, right? The scaling of creativity is about connecting people with people, connecting people with communities of practice, right? Making creativity a social good, not just an individual one, right? How do we have creativity serve the public? And I also think, amateurs are incredibly under-resourced here. We need to encourage amateur participation in as many ways as we can, decentering the kind of elite, high art model, and find ways of people engaging in creative practice much more broadly, so that those skills and those talents can be turned when needed for the public good. We've talked about mechanisms of harnessing and honing implicitly, but I'm going to make them explicit here on the last slide. We think about scaling creativity as first a process of harnessing. There's a lot of latent energy waiting out there in the public people who desire to participate but are not and because we don't have an infrastructure to allow that to happen. And you can see in the maker case just how you just turn that switch and people start to see the value of having those connections really kind of draws up our creative capacity at a societal level. So we argue that people are inherently creative, but we need to find ways of channeling that creativity and harnessing it for the public good. And then we also think skilling up is really important, right? That it's not just one-off creative participation, but that we want people to develop those skills and learning how to be creative, that kind of creative muscle that we talk about. Um, uh, it's not just participation, but it's actually getting better so that when people use their creativity, it has a bigger impact, right? So having communities of practice and mutual support can really help build that creative muscle. And, it's worth raising, we have lots of tools that have made creativity more democratic out there, right? Technology is getting a lot cheaper, but there isn't the kind of community of practice arising to support this, the ways in which we have communities of practice within the high arts community, right? So how do we find communities of practice that can help folks get critical feedback so they can get better as opposed to just doing what they've always done? So with that, I'll end. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and really appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Terry. Lots of digital and actual applause. Well done. And you've got a bunch of questions in the chat, and I will immediately remark that these are not short questions, which people
Okay.
which is, I think, an interesting sign. You've got people thinking in lots of good ways. And I had a bunch of my own questions, but I don't even need to ask them because we've got others that I want to touch on and let them go first. So I wanted to sort of call on Mel if he wanted to ask his question live. I think it'd be great. It's a nice sort of big picture theory one.
Yeah, thanks. A nice stimulation to thinking, Terence. And it certainly has folded a bit into some of my own prior thinking that pertains especially to social and cultural entrepreneurship. And it seems to me right off the top that creativity and entrepreneurship are two things that go hand in hand. So much so that I have taught courses in creativity and social entrepreneurship kind of back to back. My thinking being to equip my students in one course for effective performance in the next. So the question I raise is, and I'll partly read this and perhaps add some more as I do it, that the functionality of creativity seems to me more compatible with organizational scope as opposed to scale. And this is attributable to Chandler's work initially published in 1975. And so I'm wondering whether, if at all, some of that literature contributed to your thinking and to your work. And this arises because economists like myself sometimes get a little agitated about hearing what we now understand to be scope referred to as scale, where scale is defined simply. I mean, it really is a simple concept as bigger and better, or bigger and more, but not necessarily better. Whereas scope involves a great deal more thinking about the range of activities that an organization can be engaged in, and can expand that range of activities with modifications in production processes, with incorporation of different inputs, and so on.
Yeah. So I appreciate your question. We were not engaging that literature directly, so I would love to learn more about it. So if you don't mind sending that our way, that would be a great help. I think when we think about organizational scope, that's thinking about creativity in the service of the organization. And I think that's great. But I think what scale is giving us is this idea that there's a broad-based value, right, in creative activity, right? That regardless of the organizational scope, that having that creative capacity at a social level will provide dividends, right? And so we're pretty agnostic to the ways in which that might be cultivated. It's just how do we think about doing that well, right? Can we be more intentional about cultivating that? And our hope is that the book and the essays we've written will encourage people to start thinking more critically about that, right? How do we get that creative capacity up at the public level, rather than just kind of relying on kind of high art schools and that kind of thing. So thanks for your question. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I think that'll be a good food for thought to think through sort of scale scope. And I would go to Michael because he's got his hand up, but I'm not, because I don't want to do two economists in a row. We're going to spread this around. Rachel, do you want to ask your question or have me read it?
Sure, I can ask it.
Hey, Rachel.
Hey, Terry, good to see you and excited to see like where this project is right now. And of course, we'll be really excited, as you will be when it's out. So as you know, psychologists have really been the ones who kind of have this history of theory around creativity. I think sociologists have done a good job of showing empirical cases of how creativity works. And even just thinking about the last, 5 to 8 years, a few things around micro sociology of creativity, a few kind of review articles around maybe more like multi-scalar approaches, whether it's meso or this is the first macro approach to trying to understand creativity that I've seen. So do you all see this as a kind of sociological theory building to either push back against or complement that kind of psychological individual approach? And if so, do you see sociological methods or empirical methods that I guess economists and psychologists also could use? But is there kind of an empirical strategy for achieving what you all are talking about through this work?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. It's great to see you. Yeah, I think that is how we see one of the ways in which we see this as being a big contribution is taking that macro scale. And it's not meant to be in contrast, but in complement, I think, to more micro approaches, right? There's a great deal of work being done in this space. I'm thinking of Gordon Brett's work and Vanina Lessinger and others who are kind of thinking about the cognitive, social, kind of cultural dimensions of creativity and how do you encourage creativity. I think those are important, but they are very much looking at like team dynamics and there's a lot of that kind of interactional dimension that is the focus of that work. I think we're trying to think bigger, right? And think about this question of building that capacity, that public capacity. How do we create opportunities for building that? How do we do that with intention, as opposed to these micro level interventions that could be done, right? And so, we're not. I would say I don't think we have a methodological innovation here yet. I think what we have is a bunch of cases that we're thinking with that have been very productive for seeing patterns. So in as much as there's a comparative historical kind of approach to this, that's probably the method we're using. But I think it begs these kinds of questions, right? Like how do you develop better measures and better methods to capture the scaling of creativity, right? Most of our survey data on the arts is not capturing it, right? The questions that are being asked are not getting at this dimensionality. And so, yeah, for us, I think this is a really important push to start thinking more broadly about that question. So thanks, Rachel.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thanks. Michael, please ask the one.
Okay, and my question is actually not an economics one. So
okay.
When I worked in government, I had a boss, and whenever anybody came forward with a proposal, she'd always say, "What problem are you trying to solve?" And I haven't been able to really grasp, and it's my own thickness, what scaling is meant to do here. So I'll just give you some context. So I'm here in Bloomington, right? I live here, and I sing in a choir, and there's a number of choirs in town, and people join different ones. Some people sing in multiple choirs. Some are a bit more vocally demanding. Others are, you can be pretty much a rank amateur. There's lots of amateur theater here. And again, at different levels for people who want to get involved. There's open mic nights for singer-songwriters. There's poetry nights. There's just all kinds of things. None of these are really scalable, right? A choir is a choir. And, you perform for a local group who wants to hear your music in a church or wherever for 100 people or so, and that's kind of it. None of it is really scalable, but that's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very lively town, and I'm not counting the university. I'm putting the university entirely to the side here. There's just lots going on where people can be creative in very different ways. And it doesn't ask for scaling, and any attempts to scale it, I can't help but think would make it worse. And so I haven't really been able to get a clear sense of what you're saying here in terms of what scaling gives us in a positive way. I can see negatives actually, but
Yeah.
I'm not quite grasping what it is that we're supposed to be getting here.
Yeah, so it's, maybe a different case or different domain might be useful in helping you, and hopefully this will answer your question. Stephen and I have often talked about the rise of youth sports, right? The rapid rise of athletics, right? In the United States, Little League baseball, soccer leagues, all this stuff, right? And you can point to real dividends that participation in youth sports has given folks. It's given them a focus and attention on fitness. It's given them opportunities, maybe opportunities to show skills in one domain when other domains might be valued, right? So if you think about going to high school, right, you can if you can excel at sports, that's a pathway through life that is different from just getting straight A's or something, right? It draws national attention to nutrition in ways that weren't possible, right? And so I think we're looking to see what are the similar kinds of dividends by scaling up opportunities to engage in creativity, right? And so I think you actually could do more to scale choirs, right? You could do more to scale music participation, art. But I think there's a lot of we're trying to think more broadly about what creativity is rather than just arts, but to think about these kind of more political participation moments, right? Getting people invested in thinking of themselves as creative, right? That desire to invest more in their skills and their training, which we then think have cross-domain value, right? So if I get good at being creative in one domain, that will hopefully give me a leg up and when I move to another domain and try to be creative. So if we can kind of do that work of building that capacity, the argument is there will be social dividends that that hopefully we'd be able to measure. I mean, I think that the challenge here is we don't have a good measurement system, but that's where we're thinking that this has real power ultimately if we can get there, and you've seen that in other domains.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
It's an interesting question, I think, in part because some of this is about the scaling and scope, and part of this is about what is it that we're scaling? Is it just more people in a single choir, or is it more we're scaling opportunity to be in choir, right? And anyway, I want to turn it over to Attila, whose question is sort of about makers and amateurs, and I think it'll flow nicely into Alan's question. So go ahead, Attila.
Great. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. And actually, it's a different angle on Mel Gray's question too. That I have experience with Fab Labs in Fab Lab Budapest, and actually I figured that scalability of the institution itself is really good, and it's visible because it has rules to have a Fab Lab. You have to have 5 certain things at least. And it was awesome to go to Bloomington Fab Lab, which I immediately know what is there. But based on my experiences, it's usually people who are going there are prototypers, pro designers, and people who are trying out new ways of machinery. But it was really hard to reach out for the people who were interested in average DIY techniques, or thinkers, or average people who could actually learn a lot from these people. So my question was, uh, similar to Mary Gray's question, that when you speak about scaling, are you speaking about the scaling of these maker spaces itself, or the knowledge that these maker spaces are trying to spread, and how to differentiate the two? Because both are important, but it's sometimes it's just mixing together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think our interest isn't in differentiating them. I think it's a yes and kind of argument we're trying to make, right? That certainly the fact that South Bend, Indiana has a makerspace, right, that has brought together a lot of people in the community to learn from each other, right? That is a good in and of itself, right? The other good is that more people have more knowledge, right, and more kind of capacity, right, in terms of their creative practice, right, and also the kind of the circulation of ideas, right, that's possible, right, in those spaces. I think, I take your argument as there's some maker spaces that might be more bounded, right, so there might be barriers to entry to one Fab Lab, and some are more open, right? And I think that's true in South Bend. There are other kind of maker spaces in town, and some are controlled by schools, and no one can just walk in there, right? And others are much more public facing. I think those have different scopes, right? And so they have different missions, they have different goals, they have different communities that they're serving. Um, you know, uh, in an ideal world, would there be fewer barriers to entry and more circulation of people into those spaces? Yes. But I can also understand the argument that, maybe the training that's being done at the IU Fab Lab, right, or something might be very different than the needs of the makerspace in South Bend's community, right? And that they have different missions. Um, in general, though, more maker spaces, more collaboration, more conversations, more people engaging, how can we encourage more of all of these things? We think that there will be real dividends the more we can be intentional about that.
Thank you. Alan,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan, I love your question. Did you want to ask it, or you want me to paraphrase? Go ahead and unmute if you want to be the one to ask. There you go. Good.
Hi, Alan.
Hey, nice to see you, Terry. Thank you for
Nice to
this.
see you.
I just want to reiterate how incredibly important and valuable your work is, and thank you and Stephen for pushing on this, because it really centers public engagement, public benefit, and in doing so is deeply provocative to so many stakeholders in our sector who privilege, professionalization of creativity and creative expression. And I've hit this wall so many times, so many years ago with major funders, who I idolize professional artists, and there's just a different value system there. And what I'm looking for in this work are bridges to the nonprofit sector. And so I guess just, are you anticipating any blowback or pushback, or is just kind of one comment? And finally, I'd like to encourage you and Stephen, I'll host you if necessary, to go to Burning Man.
Yes.
And be a witness to this seething cauldron of creativity at social.
Yes. Yeah. So it's funny. We've long played with Burning Man as a possible case for the book. It might sneak its way in there. Yeah. So we'll have to have a longer conversation about that offline, I think. But the question about kind of the nonprofit world, I mean, I think we want this to be provocative, right? I mean, we want to provoke and encourage folks in the industry to kind of think about what are their values, what are they committing to, right? How are they spending their money? Are there alternatives? Could we think differently about how we're organizing the supports for creativity in this country, right? Especially as NEA is under threat, right? And there's not a lot of public support for that work. or at least political support. There's probably more public support than political support. There are real opportunities for us to think, well, what are alternatives? How could we think about investing in ways that support kind of more broad-based cultural capacities and creative capacities, rather than, training an elite few and then, honoring their work with awards and grants. So I think you're exactly right, spot on. We want this to be provocative and challenge people's thinking for sure.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, just as a note, installation work or immersive work is one pathway to scaling
Absolutely.
artistic work that can involve hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. And it's really exciting, but it's also R&D work that isn't funded and,
Yeah, right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Right. I'm a big fan of Sunil's question here, so I want to let that get a chance to be voiced if Sunil wants to ask it himself or I can.
Oh dear. Okay, let me just show me because I've seen so many good friends here. Hi. Hi everyone. Still here at the NEI. Okay. Well, actually, really good, Terry. Thank you. What's really good about it, I think when Alan just spoke, it actually anchored for me some of the space in which this emerges, right? I mean, I think as just coming with no context, if you see this, I'm left at the end a little bit scratching my head because I'm like, well, surely we all believe that, right? I mean, we all want these things. So what's controversial here? But I think my last comment is actually a little different from what Doug asked me to ask about. But I was just saying that it's I think if you were able to articulate what, not oppositionally, but what the sort of ripple effects you're seeking to have in terms of systemic change, that might be helpful. And I think when the question of scaling to what end and all that comes in. So my question was simply, I know it's not cultural economics in a very kind of microeconomic sense or anything, but I did kind of wonder, if somebody comes in and says, like I said, we all agree, like I think, I don't want to speak for others, but I think the premise looked pretty good. What would someone say if you're like, well, you said a few times, everybody's creative, and Stephen and I, Tepper, we talk all the time, and it's like, I know what he thinks generally about, we all have this fund of creativity that we just need to be given an opportunity to use it and so forth. But isn't there a little bit of is there any evaluative aspect to that? Like, can you say something about, or does your research or give you any way to talk about, well, creativity isn't a foregone conclusion, not just in access, but maybe in fundamental nurturing. And maybe this is coming back to arts education. I don't know. But speaking a little bit to the construct of creativity, as Rachel said, psychology research has really done a lot to talk about novelty and utility.
Yep.
And I don't know, I'm kind of just would like a little bit more sense of, when you say creative, is it something we all know when we see it? Or is there kind of a threshold or something that we can get a little bit more finely grained? And maybe we can't, because I think your idea of showing examples of it, like when you show those vivid kind of case study element vignettes, that I can think people can appreciate. But it's more like, in the abstract, is there a better way to talk about it? Sorry, that's not a great question. I just kind of snowballed.
No, it's a very good question, because it forces us to kind of home in on a cleaner kind of way of talking about it. So I appreciate it a great deal. I mean, I think, you saw in our definition, we were centering expression and novelty, right? I think, that's certainly being drawn on from more psychological, cognitive kind of approaches to creativity, and work in that space that makes the argument that creativity is a skill. So I think as a baseline, that's kind of where we're starting from. The question of, like, how do you know it when you see it, right? I mean, I think is an important one. I guess for me, because we're not actually measuring in that way, right? So I mean, this is a question that's independent of the project, but I think they're linked, so it's important to kind of do that. But creativity is about doing new things, right? Doing things that you weren't otherwise doing. Right. And I think in a lot of the cases that we're talking about, people making a quilt, You have people who have never made a quilt in their life making a quilt because they were given the idea and the opportunity to be able to do that, right? And our suspicion is that the more of those opportunities there are, and especially opportunities with consequence, right? Where it feels like it matters that you're doing creative work as opposed to just doing it for creativity's sake, right? I think there's value in that too, in the kind of building the capacity. But I think there's a real power in creativity with purpose and channeling people along a path where they're engaging in original thinking and novelty and expression in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. Making a space for that, and especially we can motivate that with consequence at scale, right? I think that's going to be where we see real dividends.
So I'm glad you mentioned this sort of creativity with purpose, because that's perhaps the one question I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
I looked at your creative crowds category and you brought in this purpose piece. I didn't see how that was linked back to our notion of creativity. And I think that's a really interesting, refinement, right? That's not just creativity for its own sake, and purpose tended to be very political or civic engagement minded. And that's where I started getting pretty uncomfortable. Because my first example, maybe it's just the season of the year for creative crowds, I thought of Halloween and costumes.
Totally.
You've got a lot of that going on every year. It's in
Yes.
mass. And yet that didn't seem to qualify, right? Or just parades for that matter. Holiday decorations. Like there's a lot of these kinds of things that are maybe as mundane as sort of the Michael Rushton examples of singing in a choir, but they seem to not qualify in some ways because of this piece. So I think it's an interesting one. And before I start talking, and I'm going to throw in another one that is along this line, which is about how creativity is sort of for the social good piece, where I think maybe a lot of the creativity everywhere, I'm starting to think of TikTok and how much that's made the world a better place.
Yeah.
Like I start wondering about the creativity of deep fakes.
Yeah.
Be everywhere, or already are, right? Like, so I don't know. There's no question there, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I think I think this is important. What I would say is this Halloween was the first Halloween where my kids went off without us, right? And what a loss it was not to get dressed up in a costume with them and walk around the neighborhood and see all the neighbors and feel that sense of social connection through creativity, right? And so, the idea that is not with purpose, that I think flies in the face of what we're trying to argue, right? Like, we want people to be creative for creativity's sake, but we think the more people are creative with purpose, and that could be what might be seen as mundane, but actually really important community building, connection building work, right? Of walking around the neighborhood, seeing other people's costumes, being inspired, right? Having a laugh, feeling connected to people, right? The deep sociology of, Steve and I are both sociologists, right? The deep sociology of that is something that we don't want to lose track of, right? That there's real and hard to measure, but important value in that. And we think that's a motivating force, right? We think that's the more people get that feeling of doing creativity in the service of something bigger than themselves, the easier it's going to be able to pick that up, and then it's easier to channel that into actual civic engagement, political participation, and the kinds of things that we think are going to be helpful in renewing our country, which we desperately need.
I love it. That was a great answer on so many levels. So I appreciate that, Terry.
Okay.
All right. So we're at time, and I should applaud Terry for being right on precise at a half an hour talk and then giving us a great half hour for this conversation.
Thank you
for joining us, Terry. Thank you for the questions and comments, everyone. We'll make sure that Terry gets to see the content in the chat, because I know there's a number of good links and other pieces there. But
Great.
This was fabulous, and it puts me in a great mood for the creativity and things going forward. I think we're meeting back here on December 10th, I believe is the next time we're having a workshop. So it's not quite the 2 weeks schedule on account of holidays and whatnot. So keep an eye on your email, and we'll see you back here for the next workshop. And again, thank you, Terry, so much.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your feedback.
Great. And Rachel, if we can grab the transcript from the chat and make sure that we can get it over to Terry, that would be super. Because there's just some URLs in there that he should be able to see.
Hey, Doug, thanks so much. That was
Yeah,
a lot.
thanks. I think you got some good questions, but it's
Yeah,
really
I thought the great questions were amazing. I really appreciated everything. It was good.
it's really it's great work. So keep it up and go all of that. I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. I really appreciate it. Yeah, hope to see you soon.
Indeed. All right, take care.
Bye.